Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going somewhere very few people were ever allowed to go. Behind the third gate of Topkapi Palace, past the guards and the silent courtyards, there was a world within a world, the imperial harem of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, outsiders imagined it as a place of mystery and legend. The truth, as it usually is, was quieter, stranger, and far more human. Tonight we'll walk its corridors slowly, together, and meet the women who lived their whole lives inside it. Before we begin, if these long nights of history help you drift off, please take a second to subscribe so you never miss one. And here's tonight's question for the comments. Every family has its own hidden history, a story passed down, a rumor about a great grandparent, a legend nobody can quite prove. I'd love to hear a piece of your family lore. Leave it in the comments below, and maybe tonight, while you sleep, someone on the other side of the world will be reading your family's story. So settle in, let your shoulders sink into the bed. Let the day loosen its grip on you, finger by finger. The lamps are being lit in the palace now, one by one, down long painted hallways. The city outside is going quiet, and somewhere behind those walls, a story is waiting for us. Let's begin. To understand the harem, you first have to understand where it sat, at the very heart of one of the greatest cities on earth. Picture Istanbul in the late 16th century, at the height of Ottoman power. The city spreads across 2 continents, draped over 7 hills, wrapped in water on 3 sides. The Golden Horn glitters with hundreds of small boats. The Bosphorus carries ships from the Black Sea, their holds full of grain and furs and amber. From the water, the skyline is a procession of domes and minarets, gray lead and white stone, rising and falling like a landscape of its own. At dawn and dusk, the call to prayer rolls across the rooftops from 100 minarets at once, overlapping, echoing, until the whole city seems to hum. And at the tip of the peninsula, where the Golden Horn meets the Sea of Marmara, on the site where ancient Byzantium once stood, there is a green and walled promontory covered in cypress trees, pavilions, and gardens. This is Topkapi Palace, though the Ottomans themselves usually just called it the New Palace, or simply the House of Felicity. It is not a palace in the European sense. There is no single grand building, no monumental facade meant to overwhelm a visitor from a distance. Topkapi is something older and more Eastern in its logic, a series of courtyards, one nested inside another, each more private than the last, connected by gates. To move deeper into the palace is to move closer to the Sultan, and every gate you pass is a threshold that fewer and fewer people are permitted to cross. The first courtyard is almost public. Tradesmen come and go. Janissaries drill. Firewood is stacked in great piles, and the imperial bakeries send the smell of fresh bread drifting across the cobblestones. Anyone with legitimate business can enter here, provided they dismount and keep silent, because silence in this palace is a form of respect. Visitors from Europe wrote home in astonishment about it. Thousands of people moving through the courts of the most powerful empire in the world, and hardly a sound. No shouting, no clatter, just footsteps and the wind in the plane trees. The second courtyard is the realm of government. Here the imperial council meets beneath a tower, viziers in robes of honor debating the affairs of an empire that stretches from Hungary to Yemen, From Algiers to Baghdad, gazelles and peacocks wander the lawns between the cypresses. The kitchens along one side feed thousands of people every single day, their tall chimneys smoking from before dawn until after dark. Then comes the third gate, the Gate of Felicity, with its deep canopy and its white capped guards. Beyond it lies the inner palace, the Sultan's private world, and folded into that inner world, pressed against its western side, behind walls within the walls, is the place we're going tonight, the Imperial Harem. The word itself tells you almost everything. Harem comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden, protected, sacred. The same root gives us the word for the sanctuaries of Mecca and Medina. A harem was not, in the Ottoman mind, an exotic curiosity. It was simply the private, protected part of any respectable household, the family quarters, the domestic sphere, the rooms where outsiders did not go. Every Ottoman home of any standing had one. The Sultan's was only the grandest version of something utterly ordinary, a family home. But what a home it was! The imperial harem at Topkapi grew over the centuries into a labyrinth of roughly 300 rooms, apartments, dormitories, courtyards, corridors, baths, kitchens, a hospital, a school, even its own small mosques. Its hallways were lined with Iznik tiles in blue and turquoise and coral red, painted with tulips and carnations and flowing script. Light entered through high grilled windows and colored glass, so that even at midday the rooms held a kind of underwater dimness, cool and soft. Fountains murmured in the courtyards, and this was practical as well as beautiful, because the sound of running water made quiet conversations impossible to overhear. At its height, several hundred women lived here, sometimes 400, sometimes more, depending on the rain. And here is the first thing that might surprise you. The vast majority of them were not what legend imagines. They were, in essence, staff and students. The harem was less like a pleasure garden and more like a combination of a royal household, a finishing school, and a small, self-contained town with its own hierarchy, its own economy, its own politics, its own gossip, its own friendships and rivalries, its own rhythm of days that repeated gently, year after year after year. It was also, by design, a world almost entirely without men. The Sultan entered, of course. His young sons lived there until they came of age. A few carefully chosen officials crossed its threshold on business. Doctors could be admitted in emergencies, under escort, but otherwise, the harem was a city of women, administered by women, policed at its borders by the corps of African eunuchs who guarded its single main entrance and served as its formal link to the outside world. For the women inside, the walls cut both ways. They enclosed, certainly. A harem woman did not stroll out into the streets of Istanbul on a whim, but the walls also protected, in a world that was genuinely dangerous, and they enclosed a life that many of the women came to consider a privilege: security, education, fine clothes, regular wages. Yes, wages, will come to that. And for the clever and the lucky, a real chance at wealth and influence that almost no other path in the early modern world offered to a woman born with nothing. Because that is the second surprising thing about the imperial harem. Almost every woman in it had been born with nothing. Not one of them was an Ottoman princess by birth. Not one of them, in the classical centuries, was even born a subject of the empire. The harem was staffed and populated by outsiders, by girls who arrived at its gates as strangers, often frightened, usually penniless, speaking no Turkish, knowing no one, and the story of how such a girl could arrive with nothing and end her life as the most powerful woman in the empire, richer than queens, builder of mosques, correspondent of foreign monarchs. That is the story of the harem itself. So let's follow one of them in. Let's imagine a girl at the gate. She might be 14, 15, 16 years old. She has traveled a very long way. Perhaps she was born in the Caucasus Mountains, in Georgia, or Circassia, in a stone village where the winters were long and the Sultan was only a word. Perhaps she came from the plains of Ukraine or Poland, carried south by Tatar horsemen to the great slave markets of Kaffa on the Crimean coast. Perhaps she was Greek or Serbian or Italian, taken from a coastal town by corsairs. The women of the Ottoman harem came from everywhere along the empire's vast and violent frontiers, and we should say this plainly because it is the truth. They came as slaves. However gilded the cage they entered, the road that brought them to it began with capture or sale, and with a grief we can barely imagine. A home, a language, a mother, all left behind forever. But the institution they were entering did not treat them as field hands, quite the opposite. The girls chosen for the imperial palace were selected the way one selects students for an elite academy. For beauty, yes, but just as much for intelligence, grace, and evident promise. Many were purchased in the markets by palace agents. Many others were gifts. A provincial governor, a Crimean Khan, or a great pasha hoping for favor would present a particularly promising girl to the palace, the way one might present a fine horse or a jeweled sword. It was understood by everyone, including the girl's own families in some regions, that a daughter entering the imperial harem was stepping onto a ladder. In parts of the Caucasus, there were families who raised their daughters with this in mind, teaching them songs and manners, hoping the palace might one day take them, because a girl in the palace was a girl who ate well, dressed well, and might one day pull her entire family up behind her. So imagine her now, our girl, standing at last before the walls of Topkapi. She has been bathed and dressed by the dealers or the household that presented her. She has been examined by the palace's senior women, checked for illness, questioned, appraised, with a professional eye that misses nothing. She passes through the carriage gate on the harem's western side, under the gaze of the eunuch guards, through a doorway inscribed with verses from the Koran, and the door closes behind her. The first thing that happens is that she loses her name. Whatever she was called in her village, Maria, Anastasia, Alexandra, that name stays outside the walls. She is given a new one, a Persian or Turkish name, chosen often for some quality the palace women see in her or hope to see. Mahidevran, one whose beauty never fades, Gulnihal, Rose Sapling, Nurbanu, Lady of Light, Safiye, the Pure One, Hurrem, the Joyful, the Laughing One. The new name is her first lesson. The person she was is gone, and the person she will become is being built, starting today. If she is not already Muslim, she is instructed in the faith and converts. For the palace, this is not negotiable, and for the girl, it is one more layer of the transformation. She raises her finger, recites the profession of faith in a language she is only beginning to learn, and becomes, in the eyes of the household, one of them. Then she is enrolled. because the harem, whatever else it is a school. The new girls, called akemi, novices, the same word six used for raw recruits in the army, are placed in dormitories, long rooms where they sleep side by side on bedrolls that are folded and stored away each morning under the supervision of senior women who sleep among them, and as one observer noted, keep lamps burning all night. Every novice is assigned to a senior woman, a kalfa, who becomes her mistress, her teacher, and if the girl is lucky, something like her older sister or foster mother. The kalfa teaches her everything: how to stand, how to bow, how to serve coffee without letting the cup ring against the saucer, how to speak Ottoman Turkish, that ornate court language braided from Turkish and Persian and Arabic, how to pray, how to sew, how to hold her face still, and above all, how to be silent, because the palace's rule of quiet applies inside the harem too. Novices do not chatter. They watch and they learn. The days are full. There are lessons in reading and writing, in the Quran, in music. Many girls learn an instrument, the delicate long-necked tambour, the zither-like kanun, or the frame drum, in singing, in dance, in embroidery so fine it will one day be sent as diplomatic gifts to the queens of Europe. There is real work, too, because the harem runs on the labor of its own members: laundry, sewing, the pantries, the coffee service, the endless maintenance of a household of hundreds. A novice is a servant of servants, at the bottom of everything, and her hands are rarely idle. And here is the detail that surprises almost everyone: she is paid for it. From her first day, our girl receives a daily wage from the palace treasury, a small one at the bottom, a few silver aspers, but a real wage, recorded in the registers by name, rising with every promotion she earns. The Ottoman palace kept meticulous payroll books, and thanks to them, we know how many women lived in the harem in a given year and exactly what each rank was paid. The harem was many things, but it was also, in the most literal sense, an employer, perhaps the largest employer of women in the world at that time. On top of wages came allowances of clothing and cloth, food, firewood, and gifts on festivals. A frugal woman could save. Many did. Slowly, over months and then years, the girl at the gate disappears, and someone new takes her place. A young palace woman, polished, multilingual, discreet, moving through the tiled corridors with the particular gliding walk the harem taught, indistinguishable from the hundreds who came before her. She has entered the bottom of a very tall ladder. Now let's look at the ladder itself. Every world has its map, and the harem's map was not drawn in corridors and courtyards. It was drawn in rank. At the bottom, as we've seen, were the novices, the asemis, the new girls, sleeping in rows in the dormitories, owning almost nothing, learning everything. Above them stood the ordinary trained women, the carries, who had finished their basic schooling and now served throughout the household. Above them rose the kalfas. The word means something like journeyman or assistant master, the experienced women who ran the working life of the palace and trained the young. And above the kalfas stood the ustas, the masters, the senior professionals of the harem, each one the head of a department. Because the harem was organized into departments, exactly like the sultan's outer household of men. There was a mistress of the coffee service, commanding a team trained in the elaborate ceremony of Ottoman coffee. There was a mistress of the pantry, a mistress of the laundry, a mistress of the ewer, whose team poured the water for ceremonial washing, a mistress of the table service, of the wardrobe, of the imperial baths. There was a harem treasurer, the Hazindar Usta, who managed the flow of money, cloths, and jewels, and who in later centuries became one of the most powerful figures in the entire palace. There was even a chief scribe of the harem, a woman who kept records and handled correspondence, and a mistress of ceremonies who choreographed the household's rituals down to the last bow. Each of these women had risen through the ranks over decades. Each commanded her own staff of kalfas and karies and novices. Each was paid according to her station, wore the furs and fabrics her rank entitled her to, and guarded her department's privileges with the vigilance of a guild master. When you read the palace registers, what emerges is not a den of idle beauties, but something closer to the staff structure of a great institution, a hospital, say, or a university, with career tracks, seniority, salary scales, and pensions. And it's worth pausing on that word, career. For the overwhelming majority of harem women, service was the career. Most of the hundreds of women in the palace never had any personal relationship with the sultan at all. Many rarely even saw him. They were not there for that. They were there to run the household of the imperial family, to be trained, to rise if they could, and this is the part the legends always leave out, very often eventually to leave, because the harem had an exit, and it was used constantly. After a period of service, often around 9 years in the classical period, a palace woman could be granted her freedom. She would receive her manumission papers, and with them a dowry, money, clothing, jewels, household goods, sometimes a house. And then, in a great many cases, she was married, and married well. The palace took an active hand in arranging these marriages, pairing its graduated women with officers, officials, and pashas of the sultan's outer service, men who had themselves been raised and trained in the palace school. These were considered excellent matches on both sides. For an ambitious officer, a wife trained in the imperial harem was a mark of prestige and a living connection to the palace. A woman of impeccable manners who knew how the center of the world actually worked, and who often remained in affectionate correspondence with the harem's senior women for the rest of her life. The Ottomans had a word for this whole system of placing your trained people out into the world. Such a person was your chirak, roughly your protege, your lamplit from your flame. The harem was constantly lighting lamps. Year after year, it sent its graduates out into elite households across the empire, each one a node in an invisible web of loyalty and information that led back to the palace, and above all, back to the women who ran it. When we ask how the senior women of the harem came to know everything that happened in Istanbul, and they did, this is a large part of the answer. But for the woman who stayed, the ladder kept rising, and near its top, the nature of the ranks changed. Above the world of service stood the small circle of women with a personal tie to the dynasty itself. There were the favorites, in later centuries called Iqbal, and above them the ranked consorts, the Khadans, traditionally no more than 4 at a time, who held the status of something like official companions to the Sultan, each with her own apartment, her own household of servants, her own generous allowance. And highest of all among the consorts stood any woman who had borne the Sultan a child, because motherhood, in the Ottoman system, changed everything. A woman who bore a prince was no longer simply attached to the sultan, she was attached to the dynasty's future. Her title reflected it, her income reflected it, her whole life bent around a single new purpose, her son. We'll spend time with those women soon because their stories shook empires. But there was one figure above even them, a woman at the very summit of the ladder, whom every soul in the harem, from the newest novice to the proudest consort, addressed on bended knee. Not the Sultan's wife, the Sultan's mother. To understand her, though, we first need to walk the ground she ruled. Let's take a slow tour of the harem itself, the rooms, the courtyards, the tiles, the light. If you could walk through the harem of Topkapi, and today, as a museum, you can walk through part of it, the first thing you would notice is that it makes no sense. There is no grand plan, no symmetry, no long axis drawing the eye to a throne. Instead, there are corridors that bend for no apparent reason, staircases tucked behind doors, courtyards at different levels, rooms opening into rooms opening into rooms. That's because the harem was never designed, it grew. For 3.5 centuries, sultans added apartments for new mothers, baths for new favorites, pavilions for new pleasures, schoolrooms for new princes, tearing down and building over, until the whole quarter became a dense, layered honeycomb pressed between the second courtyard and the outer gardens. Those 300 rooms we mentioned, stacked and folded into a space you could walk across in a few minutes if the doors were open. The doors were rarely all open. Let's enter the way a resident would, not through the main gate by the Divan Tower, but deeper in, along the harem's central artery, a long stone passage the palace women called, wonderfully, the Golden Roads. It isn't golden. It's a plain, high, rather austere corridor, but it runs like a spine through the whole quarter, connecting the eunuch's courtyard at one end to the innermost chambers at the other, and everything of consequence happens along it, or just off it. New consorts walked it, sultans walked it on festival mornings, by tradition scattering coins to the women lining its walls. Princes walked it on their way to their circumcision festivals, and later, some of them, on their way to the throne. Off the Golden Road, the harem sorts itself into neighborhoods. Nearest the entrance lies the courtyard of the eunuch guards, with their barracks stacked in tiers and their own small mosque, its walls tiled with images of Mecca. Just inside the harem proper come the quarters of the service women, the dormitories of the novices and carriers, plain and functional, with their kitchens and stores and their own bath. The higher your rank, the deeper you live. Past the service quarters opens the courtyard of the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, the true center of gravity. Her reception room, her bedchamber, her private bath, her courtyard where the household gathered on ceremonial days. And beyond her, deeper still, nearest the Sultan's own domain, the apartments of the consorts and favorites, and the pavilions of the Sultan himself. The geography is the org chart. In the harem, you could read a woman's importance off her address, how many rooms she held, how close they stood to the Golden Road, whether she had her own bath or shared one, whether her windows caught the sea. When a woman rose, she moved. When she fell, she moved too. Nobody needed to announce it. The furniture said everything. And what rooms they were in the noble quarters. The Ottomans decorated with tile the way other courts decorated with tapestry, and the harem holds some of the finest tile work on earth, panel after panel of Iznik ceramic in white and cobalt and turquoise, and that famous coral red that no one has ever quite reproduced, painted with tulips, carnations, hyacinths, pomegranate blossoms, and spiraling vines, so that whole walls seem to be gardens frozen in glaze. Above the tiles run bands of calligraphy, verses flowing along the walls like slow rivers. Ceilings are carved, painted, gilded. Cupboards and shelves are set into the walls, behind doors, inlaid with mother of pearl and tortoise shell. Light falls through stained glass in reds and greens, and through carved marble grills that turn plain sunlight into lace on the carpets. Because carpets, of course, are everywhere, layered over the floors, hung on walls against the winter chill, and along the walls run low divans piled with cushions, which are most of the furniture there is. An Ottoman room of this era holds almost nothing we would call furniture. No chairs, no standing tables, no beds. Life happens close to the floor. You sit on the divan or on cushions, you eat at a great tray brought in, and set on a low stand and taken away after. You sleep on bedding unrolled at night and folded into the wall cupboards each morning, so that the same room is a parlor by day and a bedroom by night. The grandest lady and the newest novice both sleep on the floor. The difference is in the silk. In winter, the rooms are warmed by braziers of gleaming brass and by the great hooded fireplaces whose conical hoods you can still see, tiled to the ceiling. Fur-lined robes come out of the cupboards. The palace distributed furs by rank, sable at the top. In summer, life migrates toward the water, to the marble fountains, to the shaded courtyards, to windows opened toward the Bosphorus breeze, and out into the outer gardens, where kiosks and pavilions stood among the roses. There were darker corners too, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. The harem had rooms whose doors stayed locked, and its beauty could enclose real cruelty. We'll come to the courtyard, the palace itself, nicknamed the cage, a little later in our story. A labyrinth keeps many kinds of secrets. But mostly, what these rooms held was daily life, hundreds of ordinary days, repeating gently, one after another. So let's live one. Let's follow the harem through a single day, from the first voice before dawn to the last lamp at night. The day begins in the dark. Before first light, a voice moves through the dormitories, one of the senior kalfas, waking the household for the dawn prayer, and by old custom, she does not simply call out. She wakes the sleeping women with a blessing, murmured over the rows of bedrolls, so that the first thing anyone hears on any day of her life in the palace is a kind word. The women rise in the gray light, wash at the fountains and basins, the ritual ablution, face and hands and feet, the water shockingly cold in winter, and pray, hundreds of them, in their rooms and courtyards, as the same prayer rolls across the dark city outside, and the first gulls begin to argue over the golden horn. Then the bedding is folded away into the cupboards, the rooms turn back into parlors, and the harem starts to move. The novices and junior women dress plainly for work, but even plainly in the palace means a long gown of good cloth over the wide trousers called shalvar, a sash at the waist, slippers, hair braided and covered with a small embroidered cap. Senior women dress according to rank and season, silks and brocades, the long fitted robe called an antari with its rows of small buttons, jeweled belts, and in winter those fur-lined overrobes. Dressing a great lady is itself a ceremony, performed by her own staff. One woman for the hair, one for the wardrobe, one for the jewel box, and it can take the better part of an hour, which is not vanity so much as protocol. In the harem, how you appear is a statement about the order of the world. Breakfast is early, and by the standards of the palace's later feasts, simple. Bread from the palace bakeries, still warm, clotted cream and honey, white cheese, olives, preserves of rose petal or sour cherry, and for many, a first small cup of coffee. Food comes up from the kitchens in a daily tide managed by the pantry mistresses, and everyone eats in her own neighborhood of the labyrinth, novices together around common trays, senior women in their apartments, each rank served by the rank below. And then the harem becomes what it mostly was, on most mornings of most years, a workplace. The laundry teams fire their coppers, the wardrobe departments sort, mend, and sew the household's own clothing, but also the endless output of ceremonial textiles, embroidered kerchiefs and towels and quilt facings, some destined as gifts for foreign courts. The coffee mistress drills her team because this afternoon, as every afternoon, there will be guests to serve somewhere in the palace, and the service must be flawless. The treasurer's staff count and record, the scribe's staff copy and file. Teachers gather their pupils. Somewhere, always, there is cleaning. The harem gleamed. The visitors agreed on this. Floors swept, and carpets beaten and brass polished. The fountains cleared, the lamps trimmed and refilled for the evening. Through all of it moves the quiet. It never stopped surprising outsiders, the discipline of the place. Orders pass in low voices, or by glance and gesture. The senior women had, by long tradition, a whole vocabulary of signs. Hundreds of people, and the loudest sounds in the building are water, birdsong from the courtyards, and the tap of slippers on stone. Mid-morning might bring lessons for the young. We'll sit in on those shortly, and for the senior women, administration. The Valide Sultan holds her morning audiences, department heads reporting, the chief eunuch bringing news and requests from the world outside, petitions to read, disputes to settle, purchases to approve. A great consort reviews her own household and her own accounts, writes her letters, receives the ladies she favors. This is the hour when the harem's other life happens, the life of information and influence, folded invisibly into the rhythm of the chores. At midday, the second prayer, and dinner, the main meal of the day, sent up from those vast kitchens across the palace. The Ottoman court ate well and ate seasonally, soups, rice pilafs, lamb stewed with quinces or chestnuts, vegetables cooked in olive oil, stuffed vine leaves, fish from the straits when the great autumn runs came through, and the puddings and pastries for which the palace kitchens employed entire specialist teams. Meals are eaten as everything is done here, communally and by rank, seated on cushions around the great trays, with a grace before and after, in near silence, and with beautiful manners. Palace women were famous for being able to eat even soup, as one account marveled, without a sound. After the midday meal, the pace loosens. There is the afternoon prayer, and then the long, soft hours that Ottoman domestic life did so well. The hours of coffee and conversation, of embroidery frames carried into the courtyards, of music practice drifting from open windows, of naps on the divans while the fountains talk to themselves. On some afternoons, there are visitors, because the harem, contrary to legend, received guests constantly. The married graduates back to see their old kalfas, the wives and mothers of great officials, merchants' women spreading silks and jewels out on the carpets for the ladies to buy, storytellers and musicians, and midwives and matchmakers. The harem's front door, watched by the eunuchs, opened many times a day. It just never opened for men. We'll save the evening for later when the lamps come back. For now, while the afternoon sun is still slanting through the marble grills, let's slip into one of those schoolrooms, because the harem's real engine was never beauty, it was education. The Ottomans thought of their palace as a school and said so. The young men of the Sultan's inner service were trained for years in the palace academy before being sent out as officers and governors. The empire was largely run by its graduates. What is less often said is that the harem was the same institution's other campus, the palace school for women, and it took its teaching just as seriously. A girl's education began, as we saw, with the fundamentals: Turkish, religion, manners, and the crafts of service. But for those who showed promise, it went far beyond. Reading and writing were taught, unevenly across the centuries, and more thoroughly at the top of the ladder, but the harem at its height was a literate place. Its senior women kept accounts, wrote and received letters, and endowed libraries. Consorts and queen mothers corresponded through their scribes and often over their own signatures and seals with grand viziers, with provincial governors, and, famously, with the queens and dogesses of Europe. We still have some of these letters. One queen mother exchanged warm diplomatic correspondence and gifts of gowns and jewels with Queen Elizabeth I of England, two powerful women writing to one another across a continent, each ruling from behind a throne. Music ran through the whole curriculum. The palace maintained what amounted to a conservatory. Girls with good ears were trained for years on the tambour and the kanun, on the kemense fiddle, the ney flute, and the frame drums. They learned the intricate makam system of Ottoman classical music, memorized song cycles, and performed in ensembles for the household's entertainments. Some became composers in their own right. We know the names of harem women whose songs entered the classical repertoire and are performed to this day. Dance was taught as an art of grace rather than spectacle, and poetry was everywhere because Ottoman high culture was drunk on poetry. An educated palace woman could quote the Persian classics and cap a verse in conversation, and some wrote poetry of their own. And then there was the needle. It's easy for us to file embroidery under quaint domestic pastimes, but in the Ottoman world, textile art was high art. The empire's silks and velvets were coveted from London to Isfahan, and the harem's workshops produced embroidery of astonishing refinement: gold and silver thread on silk and velvet, couched and knotted in patterns of tulips and blossoming branches, on kerchiefs, sashes, quilt covers, prayer mats, and robes. A woman's needlework was her portfolio. It was shown, compared, gifted, and judged, and a masterpiece could carry its maker's reputation up the ladder ahead of her. Alongside the arts came what we might call the professional curriculum. Etiquette, above all, the immense precise choreography of Ottoman court protocol: whom you bow to and how deeply, when you stand, when you speak, how you enter a room, how you serve, how you receive. Household management for the ambitious, provisioning, accounts, the command of staff, the palace's peculiar sign language and its culture of discretion. And medicine, in the domestic sense, the harem ran its own infirmary, staffed by its own women, with visiting physicians admitted only under escort. Senior women were expected to know their remedies, their fevers, their births. Midwifery, nursing, and the pharmacy of syrups and salves were harem sciences, passed from mistress to pupil like everything else. Who did the teaching? Mostly the harem taught itself, the kalfas and ustas passing down what they had been taught, each senior woman a walking archive. But tutors also came in from outside, aged scholars for religion and letters, admitted under the eunuch's escort to teach from behind a screen, music masters, including some of the empire's most celebrated composers, whose harem pupils learned the repertoire at one remove, and for the sultan's own daughters, the finest teachers the empire could summon. Because we shouldn't forget them, the princesses. Alongside the recruited girls, the harem raised the daughters of the dynasty, and their education was the school's crown. An Ottoman princess learned everything that others learned, plus the particular art of being royal. And her fate shows, from yet another angle, how much power flowed through this hidden school. Princesses were married to the empire's greatest statesmen, grand viziers, and admirals, and in those marriages there was no questions about precedence. The princess outranked her husband, kept her own palace and her own fortune, and by long custom her husband took no other wife. More than one grand vizier governed the empire by day, and went home in the evening to a wife who was, by blood and protocol, his superior, and often by training, his match in politics. Step back, and you can see what the whole system was for. The empire needed its ruling household to be staffed, generation after generation, by capable, loyal, cultivated people, and it manufactured them deliberately on both campuses of the palace school. The men it sent out as governors, the women it installed at the heads of households, including its own. The harem was not an ornament attached to Ottoman power. It was one of the workshops where Ottoman power was made. All this learning, all this discipline, and once a week, it all paused for the institution the harem loved perhaps most of all. Bath day. Of all the rooms in the harem, none was loved like the bath. The Ottomans inherited the bath from the Romans by way of Byzantium and made it their own. The hammam, the steam bath, that sequence of warm and hot marble rooms, which was at once hygiene, medicine, ceremony, and society. Every neighborhood of Istanbul had its public baths, with days or hours reserved for women, and for the women of the city the bath was the great social institution, the place you met your friends, showed off your linens, appraised prospective daughters-in-law, exchanged the news, and spent, without anyone thinking it strange, the better part of a day. The harem, being a city of women, naturally had baths of its own, several of them, graded like everything else by rank, from the big communal bath of the service women to the private marble bath of the Valide Sultan, and the magnificent double bath built for the Sultan and the Queen Mother side by side. Come along to one on a bath day. You undress in the cool outer room, wrapping yourself in the peshtamal, the striped bath wrap, and step into wooden clogs, often beautiful things, inlaid with mother of pearl and practically necessary because the marble floors ahead are hot. Then through a heavy door into the warm room, and finally the hot room, a high domed chamber the dome pierced with small round windows of thick glass so that the steam is shot through with pale pillars of light. In the center, a great slab of heated marble to lie on. Around the walls, basins of veined marble with hot and cold taps, and the sound, everywhere, always, of running and falling water. The heat does its slow work. You lie on the warm stone while your muscles unclench one by one. Attendance and in the harem, being bathed was one more service performed by rank for rank. Scrub you with the rough mitt called a kiza, sluice you with basin after basin of warm water, wash your hair with scented soaps, and knead your shoulders and back until you are, in the bath's own proverb, born again. There were soaps from Crete and Aleppo, clays for the hair, oils and essences, above all rose, the empire's signature scent, distilled by the ton in the rose valleys of the Balkans. Afterward comes the cool room, and dry wraps warmed by the brazier, and cushions, and that most Ottoman of pleasures, refreshment after the bath. Fruit sherbets cooled in the palace, with snow brought by ship and mule from the mountains, and stored in pits against the summer. Coffee, of course, sweets, and talk, oh, hours of it, the famous unhurried talk of the bath, while hair is combed out and braided and hennaed, and somebody sings, and the light from the dome moves slowly across the marble. For the harem's women, bath day was the week's holiday, and the palace treated it as such. But the hammam was also woven into every turning point of a woman's life. A bride was taken to the bath in ceremony before her wedding, henned and sung to by her friends. A new mother was bathed with ritual on the 40th day after birth. Guests of honor were entertained at the bath, the way we might host a dinner. And in the harem's own politics, an invitation to share the bath of a great lady was a mark of favor worth more than jewels, an admission, literal and social, into her private circle, into the small, steamy republic where rank relaxed just slightly, and confidences were exchanged that would never survive the dry air of the audience room. The bath also had its practical, tender side. It was the harem's clinic and its comfort. Aching joints, childbirth recovery, melancholy, sleeplessness. The prescription for half the ills of life was the hammam, and it usually helped. In a world without much privacy and with little soft treatment for the body, the bath was where the harem was kind to itself. And if you want a single image for the wealth and strangeness of this hidden world, you could do worse than the bath furnishings that survive in the museums. Bath bowls of hammered silver for pouring water, towels edged with gold embroidery too fine to dry anything, and those tall clogs of ebony and mother of pearl, made so a queen mother's feet need never touch the wet marble, ordinary objects of an ordinary Tuesday, made by the finest craftsmen of 3 continents. Steam, rosewater, silver bowls, and gossip. Remember the gossip, because in the harem, talk was never only talk. Every institution we've toured, the school, the departments, the bath, ran on the same invisible fuel, information, moving quietly from woman to woman along channels no man ever mapped. And no one commanded more of those channels or used them with more skill than the woman we've been circling all night. It's time to meet her, the most powerful woman in the empire, and for a stretch of the 17th century, arguably the most powerful person in it, the Sultan's mother. Her title was Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan, and everything about the Ottoman system conspired to make her mighty. Consider how the dynasty worked. Ottoman sultans in the classical centuries did not marry foreign princesses and build alliances through wedlock the way European kings did. After the empire's early period, they generally did not marry at all. The mothers of Ottoman princes were women of the harem, which meant that every sultan was the son of a woman who had begun life as a captive girl at the gate and had climbed rung by rung through the very school we've been touring. By the time her son girded the sword of Osman, she had spent decades inside the machinery of the palace. She knew every corridor, every account book, every faction, every secret. And now her son, often a young man, sometimes a literal child, held absolute power and trusted no one on earth the way he trusted her. The result was an office unlike anything in Europe. The Valide Sultan was the official head of the imperial household and drew the largest stipend in the entire palace, larger than the Grand Vizier's. She commanded the harem absolutely. Every appointment, every promotion, every marriage of a palace graduate passed under her hand. Her apartments sat at the physical center of the labyrinth, and her mornings, as we saw, were a working ruler's mornings. Audiences, reports, petitions, correspondence. When she traveled through the city, she rode in state in a carriage escorted by cavalry, showered with coins by her own order for the crowds. And the crowds came because to the ordinary people of Istanbul, the Valide was a very visible presence, the dynasty's great lady and its great almsgiver. That last part mattered enormously, and it's the part of harem power you can still touch today. Ottoman royal women expressed rank the way the dynasty itself did, by building. With their vast incomes, the Valides and great consorts endowed mosques, schools, hospitals, public kitchens that fed the poor by the thousand, fountains, baths, and caravanserais from Istanbul to Mecca. Walk through Istanbul now, and you are walking through their portfolio. Mosque complexes that anchor whole districts were commissioned, funded, and administered by women of the harem, women who arrived in Ottoman lands as slave girls and left their names on the skyline. One Valid built the great mosque that still stands beside the Spice Bazaar at the foot of the Galata Bridge. The bazaar itself was built as part of her endowment, its rents paying the mosque's upkeep, as they do to this day. Charity was piety, but it was also statement, stone and lead and marble announcing permanently that the hidden world had power in the visible one. And then there was politics, the real thing, at the highest level. A Valida Sultan was her son's counselor by right, and often his regent in fact. When sultans were children, or absent on campaign, or simply unequal to the throne, the Valide governed, reading the dispatches, instructing the viziers, making and unmaking the empire's chief officers. Foreign ambassadors understood perfectly well where influence lay. Their reports home are full of the Valide's doings, and their governments sent her letters and presents as they would to a reigning queen. Within the palace, her network was unmatched. Those hundreds of graduates married out into official households over the decades were her graduates. Her lamps lit from her flame, and information flowed back up the web to her apartments beside the Golden Road. None of this was secret exactly, but it was discreet, and that discretion was the whole Ottoman style of female power. A Valid did not sit enthroned in the council chamber. She listened from behind the grill. There was a screened window from the harem into the council hall, and the knowledge that she might be behind it concentrated the vizier's minds wonderfully. She spoke through letters, through the chief eunuch, through her son. The empire was governed from a sequence of small tiled rooms by a woman most of her subjects never saw, and the Ottomans, who understood power as well as anyone who has ever lived, found this entirely natural, the strong hand in the silk sleeve. Of course, an office that powerful, filled by formidable women, standing beside a throne that sometimes held weak men, that is a recipe for drama on the grandest scale. For roughly a century, from the mid 1500s to the mid 1600s, the women of the harem did not merely influence the empire. A run of extraordinary mothers and consorts effectively helped rule it through the reigns of a dozen sultans, through regencies and coups and wars. Ottoman historians themselves later named the era the Sultanate of Women, and it began, as so much in this story begins, with a girl nobody had ever heard of, unloading from a slave ship with a new name and a quick smile. Her name, the name the palace gave her, was Harem, the joyful one. Europe would come to know her as Roxolana, and she broke every rule the harem had. She was born around 1504, probably in the town of Rohatin in what is now western Ukraine, most likely the daughter of an Orthodox priest. Tradition gives her the name Alexandra and the affectionate nickname Roxolana, the Ruthenian girl. Somewhere in her teens, Tatar raiders swept through, and she vanished into the slave routes that ran south to the Crimea and across the Black Sea, one captive among thousands in one of history's cruelest commerces. By the early 1520s, she had been selected, as the most promising girls were, for the imperial harem in Istanbul, possibly presented as a gift to the young new sultan. The young new sultan was Suleiman, whom the West would call the Magnificent, 25 years old, master of the greatest power on earth, a poet, a lawgiver, and a conqueror who would spend his life on horseback from Belgrade to Baghdad. The harem he inherited ran on the old rules, and the old rules were strict. A woman who caught the sultan's eye might rise to consort. If she bore him a son, her role changed absolutely. By the unwritten law of one mother, one prince, she was to devote herself to that single son, accompany him when he was sent out as a teenage governor to the provinces, and manage his household and his prospects. Favor was temporary by design. The system was built to prevent exactly one thing: any single woman becoming permanently entrenched beside the throne. Harem became permanently entrenched beside the throne. The sources agree she was not the most beautiful woman in the palace, and they agree it didn't matter. She was quick, warm, funny. The name the harem gave her means laughter, and she captured Suleiman completely, not for a season, but for life. And then, one by one, the old rules began to fall. She bore him a son, and then, instead of retiring into single-minded prince's motherhood, she bore him another and another. 5 sons and a daughter over the years, unprecedented for one woman under the old system. When her sons came of age and went to their provincial governorships, she did not go with them, as every mother before her had. She stayed in the capital at Suleiman's side. He stopped visiting other women entirely. Foreign envoys reported with growing amazement that the most powerful man in the world had made himself, in practice, monogamous. And then Suleiman did the unthinkable. He married her. formally, legally, with celebrations, freeing her and making a former slave girl his lawful wife, something no sultan had done in centuries. Istanbul hardly knew what to make of it. The palace old guard was scandalized. The Janissaries grumbled, and none of it mattered because Suleiman was Suleiman. He moved her, and with her the heart of the harem itself, from the old palace in the city's center into Topkapi, into new apartments beside his own. In a real sense, the hidden world we've been walking all night, the harem of Topkapi, in its full glory, exists because of her. She is the reason the women's quarters came to sit at the very center of Ottoman power, wall to wall with the Sultan. What did she do with her position? Everything the office of great consort would ever do, she did first. She built magnificently. Her endowments included a great complex in Istanbul with a mosque, schools, a soup kitchen, and a hospital for women, plus baths beside Hagia Sophia that still stand and still operate, and charitable foundations as far away as Jerusalem and Mecca. She corresponded with foreign courts, exchanging letters and gifts with the Queen of Poland and the sister of the Persian Shah, a former captive from Poland's borderlands, now writing to Polish royalty as very nearly their equal. And she was Suleiman's counselor, and when he was away on his long campaigns, his eyes in the capital, writing him letters that survive, politics and palace news braided together with open, aching love poetry. My Sultan, she writes to him, there is no limit to the burning anguish of separation. And he answered in kind. Suleiman wrote her love poems under his pen name, Muhibi, the lover, some of the most personal verse any Ottoman ruler ever set down. Whatever else their story is, it is one of history's great marriages. But it is not a gentle story, and we won't pretend it is. Power beside the Ottoman throne was a mortal game because succession was a mortal game. There was no rule of eldest son inheritance. Every prince was a potential sultan, and a prince who lost the contest for the throne rarely outlived it. Hurrem played that game as it existed, for her sons' lives understand not merely their ambitions, and the era's tragedies bear her fingerprints among others. The fall of the brilliant Grand Vizier Ibrahim, once Suleiman's dearest friend, and the death of the popular Prince Mustafa, son of an earlier consort, executed by his own father's order on suspicion of rebellion, a wound the empire mourned for a generation. How much was her design, and how much the system's cold logic, historians still argue. What's certain is that when she died in 1558, in the palace, with Suleiman beside her, the Sultan buried her in a domed tomb at his own great mosque, the Suleimaniyas, where she lies today, beside the tomb where he joined her 8 years later, and that the model she invented, the entrenched, empowered, empire-shaping royal mother, did not die with her. It was just getting started. Her successors would take everything Hurrem pioneered and carry it further than she ever dreamed, all the way to the open regency of the empire. But before we climb into that storm, let's catch our breath. Let's go back down to the quiet heart of the harem's day, to the small, hot cup at the center of everything. Let's talk about coffee. Coffee reached Istanbul in the mid 1500s, up the trade routes from Yemen by way of Cairo, and the city fell in love so hard that within a generation the Ottomans had built an entire civilization around the cup. The world's first true coffee houses opened in Istanbul in the 1550s, scandalizing the authorities, who periodically tried to ban them and always failed, and coffee moved just as swiftly behind the palace walls, where it was received not as a novelty, but as an art form waiting to be perfected. In the harem, coffee was ceremony. The beans were roasted fresh in long handled pans, and the smell of roasting coffee drifting through the corridors marked the day's soft hours, the way the calls to prayer marked its firm ones. The roasted beans were pounded to flour fine powder in mortars of brass or carved wood. The powder went into the sezvo, the small, long handled pot with water and, for those who took it sweet, sugar, and was brought to the very edge of boiling over the coals, once, twice, 3 times, so that it developed its crown of pale foam. Serving it was the delicate part, and the coffee mistress trained her novices for months before they were allowed near a guest. The tiny handleless cups of porcelain, seated in filigreed holders of silver or gold, sometimes set with coral and turquoise, the embroidered napkin over the forearm, the precise depth of the bow, the pouring high and thin without a drop misplaced. The presentation, cup after cup, in strict order of the rank of everyone in the room, which the server was expected to know without asking. A great lady's coffee service moved like a small silent ballet, and it happened many times a day, every day, for centuries. Around the coffee gathered everything gentle in harem life. Coffee meant conversation. It meant the receiving of guests. It meant the confidences of the bath's cool room and the long afternoons at the embroidery frames. With it came sweets, and here we should open the door briefly onto the palace kitchens, because they were one of the wonders of the age. Ranged along the second courtyard under their 10 great domed chimneys, the imperial kitchens employed at their height well over 1,000 cooks and apprentices organized into specialist guilds: the soup cooks, the pilaf cooks, the bakers of white bread for the elite and darker loaves for the garrison, and the confectioners, the helvahane, the house of sweets, who alone numbered in the hundreds, producing not only halva and baklava and rice puddings and fruit pastes and jams of rose and quince and bitter orange, but also the palace's medicines, syrups, perfumed soaps, and scented pastilles, because in Ottoman thinking the line between the confectioner and the pharmacist was pleasantly blurred. Sherbets, cool drinks of fruit, flowers, and honey were their own department: cherry, pomegranate, tamarind, violet, rose, poured over snow from the mountain pits in summer. When the harem celebrated a birth or a festival, the sweets came up from the helvahane in processions of covered trays, and the distribution of sugar, who received which delicacy, in what quantity, in what order, was, like everything else in the palace, a precise map of favor. The harem had smaller kitchens of its own for daily needs, and braziers in the apartments where a lady's servants could prepare her coffee and warm her dishes. A great consort ran, in effect, a private catering operation within the larger machine. Provisioning all of this was one more river of the harem's hidden economy. The mistresses of the pantry dealing through the eunuchs with the markets of the city, the accounts flowing up to the treasurer answering to the valide. Even the coffee, in other words, was administration. Nothing in the palace was ever only itself. But let's not end this little detour in the account books. Let's end it where the harem's own poets would, in the late afternoon, in a tiled room with the sea light coming through the grills, with the first sip of the day's third coffee, bitter and hot under its foam, and a plate of rose-scented lokum on the low table, and the fountain murmuring in the courtyard, and someone tuning a tambour 2 rooms away, unhurried, note by note, as if time were the one thing the palace would never run out of. Hold that stillness a moment, because outside those windows, in the century after Harem, time was very much running out for a series of sultans, and the women of the harem were about to be handed, whether they sought it or not, the wheel of the empire itself. Harem had shown what was possible. The women who came after her turned it into a system. Her son Selim's beloved consort was Nurbanu, Venetian born by most accounts, captured from the Aegean as a girl of 12. And when her own son Murad took the throne in 1574, Nurbanu became Valida Sultan and something more, the first in the great line of queen mothers who openly co-managed the empire. She corresponded personally with the Doge of Venice and with Catherine de' Medici, Queen Mother of France. Indeed, the Venetians, who kept the sharpest files in Europe, treated her as a head of government in all but name. After her came Safiye, her son's consort and her political heir, Albanian born, who as Valide in the 1590s ran the palace's faction politics with a firm hand, exchanged those famous letters and gifts with Elizabeth of England, and began building on the shore below the palace the great mosque by the spice market that a later Valide would finish. Why did power keep pooling in the mothers? Partly because of the women themselves. This was a run of formidable politicians, but mostly because the dynasty had quietly changed its own rules in ways that moved the throne's center of gravity into the harem. The old system, remember, sent teenage princes out to govern provinces, each with his mother, learning rulership by doing it. And then, when the old sultan died, the princes raced for the capital and fought, and the winner, by the dynasty's own terrible law, eliminated his brothers. That law kept the empire from civil war at a price that horrified even its beneficiaries. The accession of 1595 saw 19 brothers of the new sultan buried in a single day, and Istanbul wept at the funerals. After that, the practice shifted, and princes stopped going to the provinces. Instead, they remained in the palace, raised their whole lives inside the harem in a set of apartments off the Golden Road with a courtyard whose windows looked only at walls and sky. The palace called it, with grim honesty, cafes, the cage. Brothers of a reigning sultan now generally lived, guarded, comfortable, and going quietly mad with boredom and fear, rather than dying, which was mercy of a kind. The deep fratricide faded across the 1600s, but it meant that when a sultan died, his heir was no longer a battle-tested governor arriving with an army. He was a man walking out of a courtyard he might not have left in decades, blinking in the light, knowing nothing of the world, and leaning completely on the one institution he did know, and the one person in it he trusted, the harem and his mother. Into exactly this world, around 1605, came a Greek girl of about 15, born Anastasia, renamed Mahpeker and then Kosum, consort of the young Sultan Ahmed, the builder of the Blue Mosque. And Kosum Sultan became, by any fair reckoning, the most powerful woman in Ottoman history. Her career is barely believable. When Ahmed died young, the throne passed through a season of chaos, to his gentle, mentally unfit brother, briefly to a teenage son by another mother, then back again. And when the dust settled in 1623, the new sultan was Kosim's own son, Murad, aged 11. And so Kosim did what no woman had formerly done before. She governed. As official regent, she presided over affairs of state for years, sitting behind the grill while the council met, hearing the viziers, directing policy in an empire fighting wars on two fronts and drowning in mutinies, and holding the machine together by intelligence, patronage, and sheer nerve. When Murad grew into his own fearsome rule and died young, and the throne passed to his unstable brother Ibrahim, Qasim was regent again in practice. And when Ibrahim's misrule became unbearable, she faced the darkest choice of her life and consented to his deposition, her own son, after which he was killed. She is said to have grieved him and defended the deed in the same breath. Better one life, she reasoned, than the ruin of the state. Then her grandson Mehmed took the throne at 6 years old, and Kosum, now titled the Great Valide, ruled a third time. 3 sultans, 3 regencies. Nearly half a century at or near the head of the most powerful state in the Western world, a Greek island girl who had arrived at the gate with nothing, not even her name. The people of Istanbul knew her mainly as a benefactress on a heroic scale. Her endowments fed the poor, freed imprisoned debtors with her own money, and dowered orphaned girls, and she opened granaries in famine years. The politicians knew her as the sharpest operator of the age. Everyone knew there was no getting around her. Her end came from inside the walls, as it was always going to. The mother of the boy Sultan Mehmed was a young woman named Turhan, brought from the same Ukrainian steppes as Harem a century before, and the palace was not big enough for 2 valids. Their rivalry hardened into factions, the old queen's janissary allies against the young queen's palace eunuchs, and in September 1651, in a night of coup and counter-coup, Kosum was found in her apartments and strangled by the harem's own men with, tradition says, a curtain cord. She was somewhere past 60. Istanbul closed for 3 days of mourning. The chroniclers, who feared her, mourned her anyway. And here is the strange coda. Her rival Turhan, the last of the great valides of the era, proved worthy of the office. She held the regency, then did what almost no ruler does, chose the right moment to hand power to a capable grand vizier, stepping back from politics into the traditional grandeur of her station. She finished at last the great mosque by the spice market that Safiye had begun 60 years before. It stands there today, dome and twin minarets above the ferry docks, the evening gulls wheeling around it. The new mosque, Istanbul's daily reminder that for a century the empire's silhouette was drawn in part by the women behind the grill. The Sultanate of women ebbed after Turhan, but the harem's quieter powers, the school, the network, the treasury, the long game, those never ebbed at all, and none of it could have functioned for a single day without the strangest and most misunderstood men in the empire, the guardians of the threshold. Let's meet the eunuchs. Every border needs its keepers, and the border between the harem and the world was kept by the corps of African eunuchs, and by their commander, who bore one of the grandest titles in the empire, the Aga of the Gate of Felicity, master of the girls, known to history as the chief harem eunuch. We should be honest first about where these men came from, because their story, like the women's, begins in cruelty. They were brought as boys from the lands south of the Sahara, many by way of the Nile trade, enslaved and mutilated along the route in defiance of Islamic law, which forbade the operation and so pushed it into the hands of middlemen outside the empire's borders. Most boys did not survive it. Those who did, and who were chosen for the palace, entered a career unlike any other, and the Ottomans, with their genius for institutionalizing everything, made of them not a scattering of servants, but a disciplined corps with its own school, its own barracks in that tiled courtyard by the Harem gate, its own mosque, its own ranks and promotions and pensions, a mirror image, in miniature, of the palace systems on either side of the wall they guarded. Their formal duties ran from the mundane to the magnificent. They kept the gates, checked and escorted everyone and everything that crossed the threshold, the merchants' women with their bundles of silk, the doctors, the tutors, the trays, the firewood, and stood guard through the night. They were the harem's postmen and purchasing agents, its couriers to the city and the ministries. They escorted the ladies on their rare excursions, walking beside the closed carriages. They ushered at ceremonies, announced visitors, and managed the etiquette of every encounter between the women's worlds and the men's. But the office of the chief eunuch grew into something far beyond ushering, because he alone moved freely between the Sultan's privy chamber, the Valide's audience room, and the government outside. He became the indispensable hinge of the palace, the carrier of every confidence, the broker of every arrangement. From the late 1500s, the chief harem eunuch was formally ranked among the very greatest officers of the empire, entitled to approach the sultan directly at any hour, a privilege grand viziers did not enjoy. He supervised, remarkably, the vast charitable endowments of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, a portfolio of properties and revenues spanning the empire, which made him one of the great financial administrators of the age. Chief eunuchs founded libraries and schools that still stand in Istanbul and Cairo. Several were serious scholars and patrons of learning, and more than one made and unmade grand viziers. In the faction politics of the 17th century, including the coup that ended Kösem, the eunuchs of the harem were not bystanders, but players, sometimes decisive ones. Within the walls, the eunuchs' relationship with the women they guarded was long, close, and complicated. Jailers from one angle, colleagues and allies from another, and often across the decades, something like family. A great lady and the eunuch, who had served her since she was a novice, and he was a boy, might grow old in each other's company. Two people who had lost their first worlds on opposite sides of the earth and built their second world together inside the same walls. The records show them exchanging gifts, executing each other's wills, endowing charities jointly. The harem's politics ran on such partnerships. Every faction among the women had its allies in the barracks, by the gate, and no message, favor, or fortune moved without them. It is one of history's stranger truths that at the height of the Ottoman Empire, an enslaved African man and an enslaved European woman, the chief eunuch and the Valide Sultan, could stand together at the elbow of the most absolute monarch on earth, and between them steer more of the world's affairs than most kings ever touched. The palace took children the world had treated as cargo and made some of them into its masters. That is not a defense of the system. Nothing defends the caravans and the ships, but it is the truth of how the system worked, and the people inside it knew both truths at once and lived them. The eunuchs guarded one more treasure, the most precious in the empire, sleeping most of the time in gilded cradles just off the golden road, the children. For all its politics, the harem's deepest purpose was the plainest one. It was the nursery of the dynasty. Every Ottoman sultan for centuries was born behind its walls, and the sound the labyrinth heard most often, under the fountains and the low voices, was children. A royal birth set the whole palace in motion. The mother was attended by the harem's own midwives. The birth chamber was prepared with embroidered coverlets and amulets against the evil eye, and the moment the child came, the news ran down the golden road and out through the eunuchs to the government, and Istanbul learned of it the old way, by cannon fire from the seaward walls, salvo after salvo across the water, more for a prince, and by criers in the streets. For a firstborn or a long awaited prince, there were festivals. The city illuminated for nights on end, sugar sculptures paraded from the palace kitchens, the harem hosting rounds of visits as the great ladies came in state to congratulate the mother. The cradle itself was ceremonial. A gilded, jewel set cradle was part of the office of dynastic motherhood, carried in procession, and alongside it stood the practical machinery of royal childhood, the wet nurse, carefully chosen and honored for life. Her own children became, in Ottoman eyes, milk-kin to the prince, the nursery staff of Kalfas, and around them all, the grandmother, because the Valide Sultan claimed always a commanding interest in her grandchildren. Royal children grew up wholly inside the women's world until about the age of schooling. A little prince learned his letters in the harem. His formal education began with a ceremony the whole palace attended. His first lesson, conducted by the empire's chief scholar, the child repeating the alphabet's first letters before an audience of viziers, and one of the great set pieces of the age was a princely circumcision festival which the dynasty staged as public celebrations lasting days or weeks, processions of the guilds, fireworks over the Golden Horn, feasts for the whole city, entertainments by day and night, all radiating out from a boy in a plumed cap in the harem's inner rooms. Princesses, meanwhile, were the harem's own long-term investment, raised, as we saw, to be great ladies and married young into the empire's leadership, and it must be said that these were political marriages made for the dynasty's convenience, sometimes contracted while the bride was still a child in the nursery, the wedding deferred. Her husband might be a graying vizier she had never met. Yet the institution built protections around her that were for the era extraordinary. Her property was her own, her rank was unassailable, and if her husband fell from favor or died, grand viziers did both frequently, she remained a sultana, wealthy and free, and was often married again by the palace, some princesses accumulating 3 or 4 statesman husbands across a long life while remaining, throughout, mistresses of their own households. And princes carried the golden weight of the whole system. In the old centuries, a prince left the harem at adolescence for his provincial governorship with his mother beside him, and his childhood companions and tutors became the core of a future royal court. After the change we spoke of, he stayed, and the harem women around him became the whole horizon of his youth. The apartments of the princes, The cafes stood in the harem's own precinct. His mother, his nurses, the kalfas of his little household were his teachers, his news service, and his politics. More than one sultan of the later centuries emerged onto the throne, knowing the world chiefly through the accounts of women, which is one more reason the empire's story kept being written, invisibly, in those tiled rooms. But set the weight aside for a moment, because childhood is childhood, even in a palace. The harem's registers and memoirs are full of toys and pets and small extravagances, hobby horses and drums, kites flown in the outer gardens, cages of songbirds, gazelles led on ribbons, the elderly ladies teaching the little ones their letters with candied initials, the whole labyrinth conspiring, as households do, to spoil its children. On festival mornings, the Sultan received his family's greetings, and the accounts record the gifts flowing down to the smallest members: miniature furs, tiny jeweled daggers, purses of new coins. And on summer evenings, when the household moved out to the garden pavilions, the sound over the rose beds, by every account we have, was exactly what you would guess: children running and women calling after them to slow down. Which brings us gently out of doors. We've spent our whole night so far inside the walls, but the harem's world did not end at the tiles. Let's go out into the gardens, and beyond them, out onto the water. Topkapi's walls enclosed far more green than stone. The palace occupied the whole tip of the historic peninsula, and most of it was garden. Terraced grounds falling away from the buildings down to the sea walls, planted over the centuries with cypress and plane trees, fruit orchards, vegetable plots that actually supplied the kitchens, and above all flowers, for the Ottomans were flower mad. Tulips first among all. The tulip is a Turkish flower before it is a Dutch one, carried from the steppes and bred in Istanbul into hundreds of named varieties, praised in poems, painted on the very tiles we walked past tonight. Roses beyond counting, hyacinths, carnations, jasmine on the walls. The dynasty employed whole regiments of gardeners, and the harem had gardens of its own within the greater gardens, enclosed terraces where the women could walk unveiled among the beds, sit in the shaded kiosks, and look out through the grills at the one view no wall could take away: the water, because the sea was everywhere at Topkapi. From the harem's upper windows and garden terraces, the women looked out on the busiest waterscape on earth: the Bosphorus with its currents and its dolphins, the Golden Horn crowded with caiques, the Marmara white with sails, the Asian shore across the strait with its hills and villages. The ladies knew the ships by their rigs, and the seasons by the water: the fish runs of autumn, the winter storms that threw spray over the sea walls, the spring convoys, the summer glitter. In a life of enclosure, the sea was the harem's open book, and the sources are full of women simply sitting at the grills watching it. And sometimes, more often than the legend of total seclusion admits, they went out into it. The household moved with the seasons. Sultans kept garden palaces and waterside pavilions up and down the Bosphorus and the Horn, and in the fine months the court decamped, the harem traveling by closed carriage to the shore, then by boat, the women in the cabins of the imperial caiques, slim gilded vessels rowed by dozens of oarsmen, the harem's boats screened with lattice and silk. There were excursions to the meadows at the head of the Golden Horn, the famous Sweet Waters, where the tents and carpets were spread by the streams. There were visits to the tombs of ancestors and to the great mosques made in state. There were the processions we've spoken of, when a Valide crossed the city to her own foundations, through streets lined with her charity's beneficiaries. The women saw Istanbul through carriage grilles and boat lattices, but they saw it regularly, and Istanbul, straining respectfully for a glimpse of the curtains, saw them. The seasons shaped indoor life just as firmly. Winter meant the braziers and the furs, the fireplaces roaring under their tiled hoods, chestnuts and boza, the thick, faintly fermented millet drink of Istanbul winters, sold by criers whose call was the sound of cold nights, and the long, lamplit evenings of stories we'll come to shortly. Spring meant the tulip beds and the first excursions and the great spring cleaning of the whole labyrinth. Summer meant the migration to the water pavilions, sherbet on snow, sleeping on the roof terraces on the hottest nights. Autumn brought the fish, the quinces, the preserving season when the pantries put up jams and pickles like a small industry, and the melancholy sweetness the Ottomans savored in that season above all, the poet's season. Threaded through the year ran the festivals. The two great religious holidays turned the palace into a theater of ceremony and gift giving. Everyone, from the valid to the newest novice, received festival clothes and festival money, and the Sultan's procession to prayers. The whole city turned out to watch, was observed by the harem from its own screened vantage points. The holy month of fasting reversed the household's clock, with the days quiet and the nights alive, the cannon at sunset, the lavish breaking of the fast, the lamps strung between minarets across the city, spelling blessings and lights, the drummer walking the streets before dawn to wake the faithful for the last meal. The harem heard him from inside the walls, like everyone else in Istanbul. And there were the dynasty's own festivals, the births and weddings and circumcisions, when the palace opened its purse and the golden horn burned with fireworks. Put a year of this together: the water, the gardens, the migrations, the feasts, the long candled winters, and you begin to feel the actual texture of harem time, which is the thing the scandalmongers never understood. It was not a held breath. It was a rhythm, ceremonious, seasonal, slow, and for those who made their peace with the walls, deeply orderly, a life like a long piece of music, the same themes returning year after year with small variations, from the girl at the gate to the great lady at the grill, watching the ships go by. Evening now. The light is going amber on the water, and inside the labyrinth, the lamps are being lit. Let's spend one last evening in the harem before our story moves toward its end. Dusk in the harem began with light, the lamplighters moving through the corridors at the sunset prayer, touching flame to the oil lamps in their niches and the candles in their stands, until the labyrinth glowed softly from within, all those tiled walls turning deep and warm, the gilding waking up in the ceilings. Supper was early and lighter than the midday meal, and after it came the harem's favorite hours, the long, unhurried, lamp-lit evening. What did a city of women do with its evenings for 400 years? It made its own entertainment, and made it well. There was music most nights somewhere, the household's trained ensembles playing for the great ladies, or just a few friends and an instrument in a dormitory. There were games, chess and backgammon, cards in the later centuries, riddles and rhyme games, and a parlor game the palace loved in which improvised verses were capped back and forth until someone laughed and lost. There was storytelling that most Ottoman of arts, the professional storytellers who visited from the city, and the harem's own gifted tellers, spinning out the endless romances and wonder tales of the tradition. Stories nested in stories, continued night after night with the practiced cruelty of a good cliffhanger. In the last centuries, there came shadow theater on festival nights, the famous puppets of translucent painted leather, thrown up on a lit screen, whose two bickering heroes made even queens laugh, and eventually troops of performers, jugglers, and dancers and mimics, admitted under escort for the great celebrations. And there was talk, the true engine of the evening. On the divans, over the last coffee, in the dormitories after the candles were counted, the harem talked, memory and gossip, matches and promotions. The city's news arrived via the merchants' women. The world's news arrived via the eunuchs, dreams and their interpretations, which the age took seriously, and the endless gentle litigation of who had said what to whom. Friendships in the harem were lifelong and fierce. Women who had shared a dormitory as novices exchanged letters and gifts for 50 years, and the evening was where friendship lived. Then gradually, the labyrinth put itself to bed. The night prayer, last of the five. The bedding unrolled from the cupboards, the parlors becoming bedrooms again. The senior Kalfas making their rounds, doors, candles, braziers banked for morning, and taking up, in shifts, the ancient duty of the night watch, because the harem never quite slept. In every quarter, all night, a senior woman sat awake by lamplight, minding the fires and the young. The eunuchs locked the gates and set their own watches. And the last sounds were the oldest ones, the fountains, which never stopped, the watchman's staff on the cobbles, far off in the second courtyard, the ship's sounds off the point, and the wind in the plane trees, which had heard everything and kept it all. Lie there a moment in imagination in one of the dormitories, a girl a year past the gate, her wages saved in a knotted kerchief in the cupboard, her mistress's lamp burning low across the room, the sea murmuring beyond the walls. Whatever else history was doing that night, and it was doing plenty, this was the harem too, and mostly the harem was this. Hundreds of people asleep in the heart of an empire, safe until morning. Morning always came, years of mornings. And at the end of the years, for each woman in her turn, came the day the harem let her go, one way or another. Our story has two more rooms to visit, the one where the women grew old, and the one where the whole world of the harem finally ended. Every resident of the harem, sooner or later, left it. The question was only which door. The commonest door, as we saw early tonight, was the good one, manumission and marriage. Year after year, the palace freed its trained women and married them out with dowries into the households of the elite, and this steady graduation was so central to the institution that the harem is best understood as a place most of its women passed through rather than ended in. A graduate did not vanish from the palace's life. She came back to visit. She sent her daughters to be looked over. She wrote to her old Kalfa. She called on the great lady whose protege she remained, and when the palace needed eyes and ears in her husband's world, she was gracefully, and without anything so crude being said, exactly that. Some graduates rose very high indeed. The wife of a grand vizier, running one of the empire's great households, might herself be a woman who had once folded bedding in the novices' dormitory, and their funerals decades later would be attended by weeping women from the palace where they had learned to pour coffee. There was a second door, quieter, retirement. Women who never married out, the career ustas, the treasurers and mistresses of ceremonies who gave the palace 50 years, grew old in service, honored, salaried to the end, and were pensioned when they could no longer serve. Many chose to stay near the household. Some retired to houses of their own, bought with a lifetime of wages and gifts. The most pious endowed what they had. You can still find in the old registers modest foundations established by palace women of middling rank, a fountain here, a Koran school there, a stipend for someone to pray at their grave. They were buried, often, near the great ladies they had served, the household holding its shape even in the cemeteries. And there was a third door, the one the harem spoke of in lowered voices, the old palace. When a sultan died, his harem could not simply continue. The new sultan's mother now ruled the labyrinth, and the old court had to make way. So the late sultan's women, his consorts, their attendants, the whole establishment of the previous reign, were moved across the city to the dynasty's older residence, the sprawling palace in the city center that the harem called among themselves the House of Tears, the place where the favorites of yesterday went to weep for what they had lost. It was no dungeon. The old palace was vast, dignified, fully staffed, and its senior residents remained wealthy women of rank, and for many of the young it was simply a way station to the marriage market, whence the palace matched them out to good husbands, as it always had. But for a woman who had stood at the very center of the world, who had been, perhaps, the beloved of a sultan, the mother of a prince who lost the succession, the move across town measured in a single carriage ride the whole distance between everything and afterward. The chronicles record great ladies of the old palace who spent their long remainders in prayer and charity, and one or two who intrigued from retirement so effectively that the government trembled at their letters. The harem's power did not always retire when the harem did. Which door a woman passed through, and when, was like everything in her life since the gate, mostly a matter of timing, patronage, and luck. But notice what all three doors have in common. On the far side of each stood a woman with property, a pension or a dowry, a formidable education, and a network. The system that took everything from the girl at the gate was by its own strange accounting, careful to see the woman leave with something. The Ottomans would have said it plainly. The household looks after its own forever. It was the empire's deepest ethic, and the harem was its purest expression. For 3.5 centuries, the doors opened and closed, the generations flowed through, and the labyrinth by the sea renewed itself like an orchard. It must have seemed from inside as permanent as the water and the walls. It wasn't. The world was changing outside, and in the end, the world came in. Before we reach the end of the harem's story, we should spend a moment on the harem's shadow, the imaginary harem, the one that existed for centuries in the minds of everyone locked outside. Because Europe was obsessed. From the 1500s onward, the Ottoman Empire was the great power on Christendom's doorstep, feared, envied, endlessly discussed, and nothing about it fascinated Europeans like the one place no European man could ever go. Ambassadors' reports, travelers' books, and pure inventions poured from the printing presses, and where knowledge ended, fantasy began, which meant fantasy began almost immediately. Writers who had never passed the first courtyard described the inner palace in confident detail. The word seraglio, a European mangling by way of Italian of the Persian word for palace, came to mean in every language of Europe a perfumed prison of idle beauties, ruled by whim, dripping with jewels and menace. Playwrights set operas there. Painters, especially in the 19th century, produced canvas after canvas of marble baths and reclining figures, scenes composed entirely in Paris studios from props and imagination, since not one of those painters had ever seen an Ottoman interior beyond perhaps a carpet shop. The imaginary harem said a great deal about Europe and almost nothing about the Ottomans. It was a mirror sold as a window. Every so often, though, reality got a witness, and the best of them was a sharp eyed Englishwoman named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She came to Istanbul in 1717 as the wife of the British ambassador, and she had the one credential every previous author lacked. She was a woman, and so the doors that were sealed to kings opened to her socially. She visited the baths, sat in the salons of Ottoman great ladies, was received with full ceremony by the wife of the Grand Vizier's deputy, and wrote it all home in letters that became one of the classics of travel literature. What she found demolished the fantasy on nearly every page. The women she met were not captives, pining behind bars, but formidable hostesses in command of vast households, cultivated conversationalists, mistresses of their own fortunes. She noted with some envy that an Ottoman lady's property was legally her own, secure from her husband, at a time when an Englishwoman's everything belonged to hers. The famous seclusion, she observed, functioned in practice less like imprisonment than like privacy with servants. And as for the veil in the streets, Lady Mary, with the mischief that makes her letters immortal, pointed out that it made Ottoman women effectively anonymous in public, and slyly suggested her London readers consider what a determined woman might do with guaranteed anonymity. She learned some Turkish, took to wearing the antari and shalvar herself, and pronounced them more rational than her own corsets. And in the salons, she encountered something that would change the world far beyond Istanbul: the Ottoman practice of inoculation against smallpox, performed by skilled old women with a needle and a thread of infected matter, a harem and household science passed woman to woman. Lady Mary had survived smallpox herself and lost a brother to it. She had her own small son inoculated in Istanbul, championed the practice furiously back in England against the sneers of the medical establishment, and thereby helped open the road that led, at the century's end, to vaccination. Add it to the ledger of the hidden world. Among its exports, by way of one honest visitor, was a weapon against the deadliest disease in human history. But honest visitors were rare, and the fantasy always outsold the truth. It still does, which is why tonight's tour has had to spend so much time gently setting aside what everyone knows. It is worth asking, just before we let the subject rest, why the myth was so unkillable, and the answer, probably, is that the myth was about power, not pleasure. The imaginary harem let Europe tell itself a flattering story. Over there, women are chattels and rulers are slaves to appetite, while over here, we are free and rational. The real harem told a far more uncomfortable story of an institution that took enslaved girls and made some of them into statesmen, of women wielding from behind a screen more actual power than nearly any woman in Europe, of a system alien in its cruelties and startling in its protections, refusing at every turn to fit the simple shapes the outside world kept drawing around it. Reality was complicated. The fantasy was easy. Easy travels further. The women themselves, it should be said, knew perfectly well what the world imagined of them. At least by the later centuries, the last generations of palace ladies read the European novels and saw the paintings, and their recorded reactions run from amusement to weary contempt. One elderly Kalfa, interviewed in her retirement after 1909, was asked about the fabled luxuries and intrigues and answered, "You can hear the sigh across a century, that mostly she remembered the work, the laundry, the training of the girls, the ceremonies to prepare, the accounts to balance. Mostly, she said, we were busy. Mostly, they were busy. Keep that beside the silks and the poisonings of legend, and you have the truth of the place in 5 words. Now, the frock coats and the newspapers are at the gates. Let's watch the old world end." The 19th century arrived at the Ottoman court the way it arrived everywhere, wearing a frock coat and carrying a newspaper. The empire was reforming itself top to bottom. New armies, new laws, new schools, and in 1856, the dynasty made a move heavy with symbolism. It left Topkapi. Sultan Abdülmecid built himself a new palace a few miles up the Bosphorus at Dolmabahce, and this one was European. A vast white waterfront confection of marble staircases and crystal chandeliers, with the world's largest ballroom chandelier hanging beneath a dome, gifts and purchases from the courts and factories of Europe filling room after gilded room. The harem moved with the court, of course. Dolmabahce's entire landward half was the new harem, connected to the staterooms by a single tremendous door, and the old labyrinth at Topkapi was left to caretakers, pensioners, and memory, its fountains still running for fewer and fewer listeners. Life in the new harem was recognizably the old life in new clothes, the hierarchy, the kalfas, the coffee ceremony, all carried up the shore intact. But the clothes themselves were changing. Photographs and memoirs from the era show the palace women in Paris gowns with Ottoman jewels, pianos in the apartments alongside the tambours, French tutors, and European governesses for the princesses, the daughters of the last sultans learning Chopin. The women read novels and newspapers. They watched the empire's convulsions, wars, constitutions, coups, from windows that now had plate glass. The institution still ran on enslaved service, chiefly Circassian girls whose families, in the old way, still sought the placement, long after the empire had formally moved against the slave trade. The palace remained the great exception, a living fossil of the old order at the heart of the reforming state. The end came quickly, as ends do. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution forced the restoration of the Constitution. In April 1909, after a failed counter-coup, the parliament deposed the aging autocratic Sultan Abdülhamid II. The new government, inventorying the sprawling palace establishment it had inherited, did something no one had ever done. It opened the harem's books to daylight, found roughly 200 women still in service, and ordered the institution dissolved. What followed was one of the strangest scenes in the empire's long story. Notices went out, including to the villages of the Caucasus, inviting families to come to Istanbul and collect their daughters and sisters. And they came, mountain farmers in homespun, standing awkwardly in gilded reception rooms, as officials matched them with women some had not seen in decades, great ladies of the palace in their silks, weeping as they embraced fathers and brothers, then packing a lifetime into trunks and going home to villages they barely remembered, to lives no training in the world had prepared them for. Others, with no family to claim them, were pensioned and settled in the city. The eldest Kalfas were housed near the old palaces, and for decades afterward, elderly ladies of exquisite manners could be met in certain Istanbul neighborhoods, addressed by their neighbors with the old palace titles, keeping the old courtesies over coffee served just so. The dynasty itself had little more than a decade left. The empire fell with the First World War. In 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. In 1924, the Caliphate after it, and the imperial family boarded trains and ships into exile. Topkapi, the whole dreaming labyrinth of it, became a museum, which is why you tonight, in a way denied to every outsider for 400 years, can simply buy a ticket and walk down the Golden Road. Go, if you ever have the chance. Go late in the day when the tour groups thin out. The tiles are still there, the tulips and the carnations, the coral red no one can reproduce. The fountains still run in the courtyards. The Validay's audience room still holds its hush, and the little mirrored pavilions still double the sea light the way they did for Kosim and Turhan and 1,000 women whose names the registers keep and no one now remembers. The coffee mistresses, the treasurers, the kalfas who woke the dormitories with blessings, the girls at the gate. Stand a moment in the last courtyard and listen. Water, wind in the plane trees, gulls off the point. The empire is gone. The sounds are the ones they heard. Historians today read the harem very differently from the fantasists of old, through its account books and letters and buildings, and what they find is what we've found tonight. Not a legend, but an institution, not a den, but a school, a treasury, a nursery, a court, a world built on a profound injustice that nonetheless became, for the women who mastered it, an engine of improbable power, the strangest ladder ever offered to the powerless, climbed all the way to the top, more than once, by girls who arrived with nothing at all. That is the hidden world of the Ottoman harem. Not hidden anymore, just quiet, the way old stone is quiet, holding its 400 years of voices somewhere below hearing. And quiet now is where we're headed to. Our tour is over. The golden road is behind us, and the gate is closing softly one last time. If you're still awake, let the images settle where they'll do the most good. The blue and coral tiles, holding their gardens of glaze in the lamplight. The fountains, talking quietly to themselves in the empty courtyards, the way they have for 400 years. The steam rising through pillars of light under the dome of the bath. The smell of roasting coffee in a stone corridor. The gilded caiques on the evening water, and the ships passing the point under a low amber sun. The dormitory at night, the rows of sleepers, the one lamp kept burning, the senior woman sitting up with her needlework, minding the fire, minding the young, while the whole city sleeps around the walls, and the women, the girl at the gate learning her new name, the Kalfa waking the household with a blessing in the dark, the coffee mistress and her silent ballet, Lady Mary in her borrowed robes, scribbling the truth by candlelight. Hurrem, laughing her way past every rule the empire had. Kosum behind the grill, holding the state together with both hands. The old Kalfa in her retirement, remembering past all the legends, simply the work. They are all asleep now, a long time asleep, in the quiet cemeteries by the mosques they built and served. The empire that enclosed them is gone. The walls they lived behind are a museum, and the secrets they kept so carefully belong to everyone, and to no one, and to the wind in the plane trees. Let your own day go the same way now. Whatever you carried into tonight, the tasks, the worries, the unfinished conversations, set it down outside the door, the way every visitor to the palace set down her burdens at the threshold. It will keep until morning. Everything keeps until morning. That was the harem's oldest lesson, learned over 100,000 nights behind the walls. The day ends, the lamps are trimmed, the watch is set, and sleep comes to the novice and the queen mother alike, the great democracy of the dark. Feel the bed holding you, the whole weight of you, the way the divans held 4 centuries of sleepers. Let your breathing slow to the pace of the fountains, in and out. The rooms of your mind going dim one by one, like the corridors at the night prayer, the far rooms first, then the near ones, until only one small lamp is left, and then gently not even that. The watch is set, the gates are locked, the city is quiet, and the sea is quiet, and the long story is over for tonight. Thank you for spending this evening in the hidden world with me. If it helped you drift, the next story will be waiting when you need it. Sleep well, sleep deeply. Good night.